Okay, we're back in our study of creation. If you open up your Bible, it says Genesis chapter 1. Last time we had a lesson, we were talking about this darkness in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, where it goes, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." And we were talking about this darkness. I'm going to put darkness up here again. And we talked about how darkness comes in three forms. There's a physical darkness, there's a spiritual darkness, and then we're going to go over today a judgment of darkness. And today we're going to wrap up this darkness and what it is. And then we're going to talk about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and how that relates to all this. And we're going to sort of tie all that together, so you're going to want to understand that here soon. And in relation to all this, we've been talking about how in creation there's a couple of different views of creation. There's people that believe in the literal 6 days. Oh, my marker's going out. Let me grab another one. This one. There's people who believe in a literal 6 days. And then there's the other viewpoint of some type of gap, and then you have your 6 days. Okay? And we've been showing how a lot of creation, a lot of creative acts had to have happened back here in this time frame. And we've been showing too through this darkness that appears in Genesis 1:2, how all this darkness had to come into being back here in this gap. It couldn't have taken place after 6-day creation. We're going to go into a little bit more of that in a few minutes when we get to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But in relationship to the darkness, we showed last time in the last lesson how there's physical darkness in the universe in verse 2, and how there's a spiritual darkness. And that spiritual darkness is by Satan. It's caused by him. Turn back to, let's go to Acts chapter 26. Let's just start here. Acts 26, verse 18. And it says, "To open their eyes, and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God." The power of Satan is where spiritual darkness is. It originated with Satan. It started with him in his heart. And we're going to look at that in a couple minutes. But spiritual darkness originates with Satan. He's the power and the prince of darkness. And that's what we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And we see how he originated this darkness, and he's there, and he causes that spiritual darkness back there in Genesis 1:2. And he has rulers, and he has principalities that have joined him in this darkness, and we saw that over in Ephesians. But I turn over to something interesting about Satan, though, John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, about this darkness, we're talking about Satan here for a second. We understand, well, maybe we'll start, we'll just stay here in John chapter 8. Because there's something about Satan here that I'm trying to show that this spiritual darkness started back here in this what we would call the gap understanding. John chapter 8, verse 39, Jesus is talking with the Pharisees here. And he says, "And they answered, and said unto him, Abraham is our father. Jesus saith unto them, if ye were Abraham's children, ye would do the works of Abraham." When Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, they claim Abraham as their father. Verse 40, "But now ye seek to kill me, a man that hath told you the truth, which I have heard of God. This did not Abraham." Abraham didn't try and kill God, but the Pharisees are. "Ye do the deeds of your father." Jesus Christ tells the Pharisees, you do the deeds of your father. Then they said unto him, "We be not born of fornication." Now, side note, that's an interesting subject to think about in the study. They're saying Jesus Christ was born of fornication. You know what they're calling Mary? And the relationship that she had a child out of wedlock? I mean, you follow that down, and you think about that's a terrible thing to be calling Jesus Christ there. And an awful, awful sin to accuse Mary of. How terrible. But they go on. We have one Father, even God. And Jesus said unto them, if God were your Father, ye would love me, for I proceed forth and came from God. Neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Why do ye not understand my speech? Even because ye cannot hear my word. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. Jesus Christ tells the Pharisees, your father is the devil, and you will do the same things he did. Now, what did Satan do? He was a murderer from where? The beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. This verse tells me that Satan was a murderer from when? The beginning. Now, when we think about the beginning, when did Satan murder? In the beginning. Now let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. We see verse 1, in the beginning God created, and we've been talking a lot about the beginning. And we just learned that sometime back here, before God reconstructs the earth, we learned that there was spiritual darkness there. We learned that Satan rebelled back then. We just learned that back then Satan murdered. Now some people try and say, they take that verse and they say, well, I've asked different people, who did Satan murder? And I don't really understand who he murdered. But some people try to say, well, he murdered Abel through Cain. Well, that's really not the beginning, though. Mm-hmm. That's hundreds of years after it. That's not the beginning. And so that verse there in John just told me something about Satan, that he was a murderer from the beginning. That tells me that when Satan rebelled, it had to happen before the 6 days of creation, of the recreation of the earth. That's where this spiritual darkness comes from. Now, I'm not exactly sure who he murdered and how that took place. I have some ideas on that, and I'm not going to go into that today. But I just want to make the point, is that Jesus Christ said Satan was a murderer from the beginning. He caused a rebellion to take place. And that all brought about this spiritual darkness that we find in Genesis 1:2. And all that had to have taken place back here. You understand that? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's important. And he was Satan was the originator of evil. He was the originator of a false wisdom. Remember we talked about, when we first started this, we talked about how there's two wisdoms out there. There's a wisdom of God. And we started this lesson, this series out on how God was created everything in wisdom. And then we talked about how there's another wisdom. There's a wisdom of, we'll just call it Satan. There's another knowledge that fights against the knowledge of God. Remember we talked about that several lessons, in one of the first lessons, how it's a battle between wisdoms. Well, this wisdom that Satan developed was created back here. That's what caused all the spiritual darkness. Turn over to Ezekiel. Ezekiel 28. Let's see when that was created. Ezekiel 28. See, we understand here in Ezekiel, this talks about Satan, and it talks about the day he was created, verse 15. Thou wast perfect in thy ways. Ezekiel 28, verse 15, talking about Lucifer. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. When Satan was created, he was perfect. God did not create sin within Lucifer. Okay? That just told us there. He was perfect in his ways. Satan knew everything he needed to know about the Lord. Till iniquity was found in thee. There was a day when the Lord looked upon Satan and he saw sin. That was not there when Satan was created. That happened later after God created him. Satan fell. Verse 16. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Satan rebelled against God and sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thy heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. Remember, this is where this other wisdom comes into play. See, Satan created this other wisdom that is against God. And that's when Satan sinned. All of this happened within the heart of Satan. Okay? This is important. Satan is the originator of this other knowledge, of this other wisdom that fights against the wisdom of God. Satan is the originator of this thought process that attacks God and that attacks the wisdom and the knowledge of God. Okay? It developed within the heart of Satan. He's the one who founded it. God did not create sin. God did not create this other wisdom. God did not create this other knowledge that fights him. Okay? That all developed within the heart of Satan. Satan developed. He's the originator. He's the creator of all that. God is not the author of sin. God created Satan perfect. But Satan used his free will choice that God gave him and created another wisdom and another knowledge, and therefore Satan fell and sinned. Okay? Now I'm telling you this, all this happened back here, before Genesis 1-2. That's what brings about the darkness that we see in Genesis 1-2, is this other knowledge. You see, turn over to Isaiah 45. Isaiah 45. Some people say, well, how about Isaiah 45, verse 7? Now, we talked about this verse last week, the first part of it. And we talked about, it talked about the Lord and some of the things he makes here, some of the things he creates. I form the light and create darkness. And we talked about how that darkness is not spiritual darkness. That darkness there was physical darkness, that when God left the universe of his creation and he withdrew into that third heaven, he left behind darkness. And he had to create darkness because there was no need for it, because he was ever present everywhere in his creation up until the time Satan sinned. Okay? And when God withdrew himself, he had to leave something behind, so he creates darkness. But at the end of that verse, I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now, that verse is misused by a lot of people. That verse says, God created evil, and he did create evil. But that's not the evil of Satan. What that evil there is when Satan sinned, God had to create chastisement or bad things to happen to punish what Satan did. And that's evil. You know, God had to do evil things to Satan to punish what he did. It was never in God's mind to create evil, to ever have to punish wrongdoing. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. See, God had to create evil. It wasn't part of his original creation. When did God create evil? He created it when Satan fell, when Satan sinned. And God had to create a mechanism to punish that rebellion, and therefore he creates evil. Evil is bringing bad things upon something. God never had it in his heart to do that, but he had to create that in order to punish Satan in his rebellion. So that evil there in Isaiah is not the evil of Satan. See, evil can be used two different ways. Evil is used when you have to bring punishment on something. You know, when you have to punish, chastisement, that's evil. But evil is also sin. When you do bad things. Okay? There's two definitions there. And I think we understand that. Satan is the author of sin. He sinned first. God is the author of evil to bring punishment and chastisement upon those who sin. And it was never God's intention to have to do that. But he did when sin entered the universe. Okay? So with all that understanding, and we see, we went through a lot of stuff last week on how Satan, there's this spiritual darkness out there. And now we see how Satan's the author of it. He's the one who created sin. And then he went out and he trafficked it, and he merchandised it, and he sold it to the angelic realm. And he got others to buy into it. And when Satan started on this path, he murdered. How that all took place, I'm not exactly sure. I just know it did. Just know it did. He's the author of this. So, how do I know all this happened back here? I go back to Genesis chapter 2. Let's see here. Genesis chapter 2. Well, let's start in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image. Day 6. God creates man. Okay? And we're going to go through this later once we get up to it. Okay? And verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. We're going to talk about that subdue in a couple minutes maybe. And have dominion over everything. Okay? So, day 6, God makes man on day 6. I'll put it here. Day 6, man. Now, Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 is like going to focus on day number 6, on the creation of man. Okay? The things that happen in Genesis chapter 2 are the things that happen about the creation. Verse 7, chapter 2. And the Lord formed man in the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. On day 6, this sort of gives us he's just focusing in on day 6. And we're going to go through this a little bit more in depth when we get to it, which will be soon. But I want to point out a couple of things that the Lord does here. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. There he put the man whom he had formed. On day 6, God takes Adam and he puts him in the Garden of Eden. Got that? Pretty simple. In that garden, God plants some trees. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also. In this Garden of Eden, I should put it over here, we find the tree of life. Day 6, God plants tree of life, puts Adam there. But what else do we find on day 6? And, the end of verse 9, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Tree of good and evil. Now let me ask you this. If you subscribe to all this, that God created the earth in 6 days, and then after the 6 days Satan fell, which is how we call those young earth creationists or people who don't believe in the gap. And there's people that do. If you believe that, then you have to understand that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God created that. You're making God the author of sin. Because the tree of knowledge of good and evil, if you understand what the tree of knowledge of good and evil, how it's the rebellion, it's the wisdom, it's the knowledge that is against God. That originated from who? Satan. Therefore, Satan had to fall before day 6. Therefore, Satan had to fall before God started to reconstitute the earth. Do you understand that? Because if you believe Satan was still perfect on day 6, as many young earth creationists do, then you're making God the author of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because it existed on day 6. Did I lose you here? Are we starting to understand what the dichotomy is here? The tree of knowledge of good and evil is existing on day 6. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is everything bad. God did not create this tree. This tree originated in the heart of Satan. This knowledge existed because God did not create this knowledge. God is not the author of sin. Therefore, Satan had to fall in order for this tree to even exist back here. If you believe that Satan didn't fall until after day 6, well then you got a problem with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because where did it come from? Did God create that? Then now you're saying God's the author of all the true evil, not the punishment kind, not the chastening kind, but the sin kind, when he created that tree. That's not true. We just learned that tree grew out of the heart of Satan, and out of his heart came sin, and that sin multiplied, and God put a name on it, and that name was knowledge of good and evil. A knowledge against him. That's really important to understand when you're looking at how everything was created. You know, that spiritual darkness in Genesis 1:2 grew out of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as that tree came out of the heart of Satan. God did not make and create that tree. That tree was created by Satan. That tree was in garden on day 6. Satan could not have fell after day 6, because then that's making God the author of that. Satan had to fall back here in what we call the gap, or what we call before the days of men. That's why when we read Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, and the earth was without form and darkness upon the face of the, that darkness grew out of that tree which already existed. Because Satan fell, he was a murderer. He murdered in the beginning. And when we read there about Satan's heart, how his heart was corrupted by wisdom, that's the wisdom that's contained in that tree. You have to understand what that tree of knowledge, the more you understand about the evil of that tree, the more you understand how that all came out of the heart of Satan, and that had to come out before God shows up to reconstitute the earth that we live in.
Are you saying spiritual darkness created that tree?
Yes.
Okay.
That tree,
The ties it
spiritual
together
darkness, is that.
Mm-hmm.
That's spiritual darkness. Just as the tree of life is spiritual life, and it grants physical life also, this tree brings spiritual death and also physical death. And we'll see that when we get over there and we look at it a little bit more closely. But what I'm trying to say now is that just the fact that this tree exists on day 6 tells me it had to originate, Satan had to fall before day 6. Just to have this thing, because God is not the author of that. It never came into God's mind to create sin. We just learned that sin was created by Satan. And this, the fact that the tree exists on day 6, proves Satan fell back here before the days of men start counting. To me, that's profound. That's something you can't get around. I'm not going to lay this tree at the foot of God. I'm not going to say God's the author of that knowledge. God would never create a knowledge that goes against him. That tree was created by Satan. That spiritual wickedness came from the heart of Satan, and then he spread it throughout the universe. And we've seen how the universe, Genesis 1:1 was created like this. We saw how God withdrew to the third heaven, and he put a cloud there, and he made darkness down there. And all that happened because Satan had rebelled in that original creation. Satan had grew this tree of knowledge, good and evil, and he spread it throughout the universe, to the other angels out there, to the other principalities and powers, and they all bit into it. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. Right. And God had to create evil as a form of judgment against his creation. and he punishes them by flooding the universe with water. And he breaks up the deep, and he floods this. And we're going to get into that a little bit in another lesson or two when we actually get into how God reconstitutes this. And we're going to see some verses in Psalms where he broke up the deep, and when he breaks it up, it just flooded everything. And that's why when we come to Genesis chapter 1 here, we're going to see in a few verses, when we get there, all this is filled with water. Why? Well, we just learned why. Because God created evil to punish this. So, where are we? The darkness. All this comes out of the darkness in Genesis 1:2. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. We've seen how there's physical darkness. We've just wrapped up how there's spiritual darkness. This spiritual darkness came from Satan. It was out of the heart of Satan that the knowledge of good and evil came from. It was out of his heart that this other wisdom came from that fights God. We see how this tree of knowledge of good and evil, that knowledge existed before day 6 because it came out of Satan. Now there's a third type of darkness I want to get into. We're going to move on now. This darkness not only represents a physical darkness, not only represents spiritual darkness, but darkness is also used in the scriptures as part of God's judgment. When God judges, many times he uses darkness when he does that. Turn over to Exodus chapter 10. Exodus chapter 10, verse 22. We know about the battle between Pharaoh and Moses, and how God had asked Pharaoh to do some things through Moses, and Pharaoh said no. Pharaoh was not going to listen to God. And God starts to judge Egypt. And he brings plagues on Egypt as evil, as chastisements, as to punish Pharaoh. And one of the plagues God brings, verse 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thy hand towards heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. One of the plagues God brings upon Egypt is darkness. Darkness God uses as a form of judgment. See, when we see the darkness back in Genesis 1:2, we see it as physical, we see it as spiritual, but it's also there as a judgment of God against what Satan did when he rebelled and sinned and created that knowledge of good and evil. That darkness in Genesis 1:2 is all these. Just as God used darkness on Pharaoh, God used darkness on Satan. God uses darkness when he judges. Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 13. Jeremiah chapter 13. Verse 16. Verse 15. We'll just start there. Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for the Lord hath spoken. Give glory to the Lord your God before he cause darkness, and before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains. And while ye look for light, ye turn it into the shadow of death, and make it gross darkness. Jeremiah is talking to Israel, and he says, turn back to the Lord before he brings darkness upon the land, and you stumble and fall. God uses darkness as a form of judgment to judge those and to punish those. When we see the Lord going to come back at the day of the Lord, turn over to Amos. Amos chapter 5. Verse 18. Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos. Amos. Amos chapter 5, verse 18. When talking about the day of the Lord, when God's going to come back and destroy the enemies of the earth that are attacking Israel, he calls it a day of darkness. Amos chapter 5, verse 18. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. You know, there are people actually praying for the Lord to come back. You don't want that right now. When the Lord comes back, He's coming back to destroy and to kill. Yeah, we look forward to the rapture. But we also know that when the rapture happens, the day of the Lord's going to happen. So all of you wishing for the rapture to happen tomorrow, or today, which is actually a good thing, but know that right after that, the day of the Lord's going to come. He's going to start wiping out millions of people. The day of the Lord. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light. As if a man did flee from a lion, a bear met him, or went into a house and leaned upon the wall, and a serpent bit him. Shall not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light? Even very dark and no. When God comes back to judge the earth, He comes back in a day of darkness. Darkness there is a type of judgment. Turn over to Zephaniah, a couple books to the right. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 15. Verse 14, Zephaniah chapter 1, 14. That great day of the Lord is near, it is near, and hasteneth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. We should understand what this day of the Lord. Fortunately, we're not going to go through it. It's going to be a terrible day. Day of the wrath of God being poured upon this earth. The mighty man shall cry bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of waste and desolation, a day of darkness. That day of darkness is a day of wrath. Their darkness is conjoined with God's wrath being poured out. Turn back over to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 19. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 19. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened, and the people shall be as fuel of the fire. No man shall spare his brother. The wrath of the Lord is through the darkness that the Lord brings upon the land, His wrath. So when we go back to Genesis chapter 1, let's turn there, and let's look at verse 2 again. And we see the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That darkness is all-encompassing of all three elements of what darkness can be. Mm-hmm. This is what darkness is. It comes in three forms. And all three are present in Genesis 1-2. We've seen physical darkness. We've seen spiritual darkness. And now we know there was a judgment of darkness that enveloped the universe. And God withdrew Himself up to the third heaven. And up here, there's still light. Remember when God brought darkness upon the land of Egypt? There was light in one place, remember? Where the Jews were, where Israel was, there was light there. But everything else was dark. It's the same thing. There's light up here in the third heaven, but God closed it off. He put a cloud between Him and them. That's the same thing that happened in Egypt. Exactly. There's a cloud that buffered Egypt from Israel, and Israel had light, but through that cloud there was darkness, and the light of Israel couldn't break through to give Pharaoh light. It was the same thing here. So, we say all that to just point out in Genesis chapter 1-2, there's darkness on the face of the universe. And that darkness is physical, spiritual, and judgment by God. And we see how that darkness is all represented by Satan. So, Satan's there in Genesis 1-2. The rebellion has taken place, God has judged that universe that He created, and He found it wanting because there was sin in it, and He had judged it. And now we're in Genesis 1-2, and we see the darkness there. And that's what it's all about. That's what that darkness is. So, we're going to stop there for this portion of the lesson and go on. We're going to get into the without form and void in the next lesson and talk about why that's there now. But I just really wanted us to understand the importance of that darkness and what all that means. It wasn't just dark like this. There's a whole lot more going on. Okay, that's good.